So as we turn to what the interpretation of the vision is, one thing that should have stood out already, is that the fourth kingdom and the little horn's activities do trigger the final judgment. And the final judgment, I say, because the Ancient of Days has taken his throne, and this beast seems like the most extreme expression of a pagan Gentile empire, and so dangerous that it has to be that God has to intervene and directly judge the little horn because of the little horn's threat to the world. So that seems to be built in naturally into the vision. And of course, that's the fourth kingdom, although it has lots of these sort of extremities or extending parts, which make it a little bit more interesting. Now, some people think that these beasts are indeterminable. In other words, it never actually tells us specifically what the beasts represent in the second half of the chapter, so we really can't say. And I respect this because I appreciate when someone says that we shouldn't go farther than what Scripture says. It's in 1 Corinthians 4, it says, "Go not beyond what is written." So I think it's a healthy caution to not just jump into assuming what these beasts might represent, what empires or governments they represent. If it doesn't tell us specifically, maybe we can't know for certain. I'm not persuaded by this, I should say, but I do respect that position. The reason I'm not persuaded, of course, is because we've already noticed, haven't we, that in the map here of the whole book of Daniel, that the first half of the book and the second half of the book, that these stories parallel one another. And since we did know from chapter 2 that the head, the first of the four parts, was Babylon, and that there was a similar pattern in the way they decreased in value but increased in strength. And we saw the same thing with the four beasts. So that alone makes me inclined to think we can apply the same four empires to the two visions. Okay? So that's my first thing. And then, of course, as we go to the vision itself, we see that the first one is a lion with eagle's wings. And, of course, anyone who has seen the Ishtar Gate, which is one of the gates going into Babylon, you see these very images of lions with eagle's wings. And then, of course, we're told that this lion had his wings plucked off, and he was given the mind of a man was given to it. In other words, he seems humanized, and he has a sense of reason, a mind. And of course, that reminds us, doesn't it, of what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. If this represents Babylon, if the head of gold is Babylon, particularly Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, then that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 4, he was judged by God, and he became like a beast. But then at the end of 7 years, it says his reason returned to him, and his mind got set straight, and he understood the truth and was prepared to obey God and submit to God's authority. So that made him safe, so to speak. And so this is why I think, for all these reasons, that the lion seems sort of obviously to me to be the same as the head of gold. It is Babylon. Then when you go on to the next beast, we have a bear. Now a bear, of course, is much bigger, slower, but much bigger and more powerful. And we know that after the, where shall I write these? Here. That after Babylon, right, we know even within the book of Daniel itself that the Medo-Persian Empire succeeded Babylon. Remember the judgment at the night where Belshazzar saw the hand writing on the wall? It was the Medes and the Persians that took over Babylon. And the Medo-Persian Empire, in other words, it seems very improbable to me that Daniel, who actually lived through this transfer of power from the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians, and then incorporates it into his book. It happened toward the end of his life. It's hard to imagine Daniel didn't see that obviously the chest of silver was the Medo-Persian Empire, since it comes after the head of gold, and that the bear wasn't the Medo-Persian Empire. And of course, the Medo-Persian Empire was significantly larger than the Babylonian Empire, and it was much stronger. It endured for a lot longer period. Now, Daniel didn't know that at the time, but it ends up enduring for 4 times or so as long as the Babylonian Empire. So that's another reason why I think the bear sort of clearly represents the Medo-Persians. And then, of course, we get to a leopard, but a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And if you know anything of what happens after the Medo-Persians, right? We have Babylon, then we have the Medo-Persian Empire, and who comes after them but Greece, the Greeks. Now, what do we know about the Greeks? Well, I'll tell you one thing about the Greeks. They were known for, have you ever heard the expression, beware of Greeks bearing gifts? The Greeks were Odyssean. You know the story of the Trojan horse that they hid in the fake, or rather the monument to Athena, of the giant horse. They were tricksters. They were clever. They were smart, but in a very clever, stealthy kind of way. Like you couldn't trust them. You know what I mean? They're very clever, but then of course clever can mean kind of don't trust them, and it always seems like they're out-tricking you, outsmarting you. And so this, of course, is effectively presented by a leopard, because cats are very stealthy and sly and clever in their hunt. All right? But of course, this one has 4 wings, is very fast, and the Greeks were known, the Alexandrian Empire, known for how swiftly it destroyed the Persian Empire, even though the Persian Empire was much bigger. A leopard killing a bear, you think, well, how's a leopard going to kill a bear? Well, in part because it's a lot faster. It's the sheer velocity of the Greek army was impressive, how fast it moved and what it accomplished on the battlefield. So they defeated the Persians, and of course they had 4 heads, because eventually Alexander's empire, after he died, he only ruled for 10 years of his military campaigns, and then he died, and then his kingdom was divided into 4 different kings. It was put under 4 different kings who ended up warring against one another, like the Seleucids against the Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucid Empire up in the Medo-Persian and Babylonian area. And we're going to learn a lot more about the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. The Ptolemaic Empire was the one out of which Cleopatra came, the Greek princess, queen. So you're going to see then that seems appropriate that we have a leopard with 4 heads. There's a lot of parallelisms there with the Greeks. And then, of course, the final one, which should be kind of obvious after the Greeks, the Romans, okay, the final empire of Rome, okay, and it is the strongest and the most dreadful and terrifying and strong, and by far Rome was much larger, much more powerful, much stronger than all these previous 3 empires, and of course lasted 1,000+ years, actually another 1,000 years, really 2,000 years in the East. All right, so that's, as far as that goes, that doesn't seem to me to be that, it shouldn't really be that controversial, though some people have a different opinion about it. It's totally fine. And then when we get to the little horn, we notice that we have these, first of all, these 10 horns, and remember that there were the references to the toes back in chapter 2. Now, the reason that seems kind of important to me is because these are extremities. They're sort of the far-reaching tendrils, or whatever you want to call it, extremities sticking out at the toes. In other words, at the very end of this succession of empires are these 10 toes that come out from the legs. And then, of course, the horns are coming out of the head of the beast and sticking way out ahead of the very head of the beast. And then eventually this little horn pops up, and he ends up ripping out the 3 previous horns. Now, what exactly are these horns, and what are these toes, and so on? The answer is that this part is not as clear to me. It's just not. I don't feel as confident. I've looked at many commentaries, and I don't think there's a real strong. There's certainly no consensus. I don't think there's even a strong opinion or a majority opinion of sort of what they might represent. Are they representing sort of 10 Caesars or emperors or kings under the Romans toward the end of the empire? Or are they representing something at the time of Jesus? Because some people think that the judgment that's being described in this chapter isn't really the final judgment on the world, but is rather just what happened at the cross when Jesus came and God sort of judging or vanquishing his enemies through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then who would the little horn be? Is that Nero or something? It's all this all gets very fuzzy, and there's very little consensus about whether this is representing some very specific people and who are they within the Roman world. And then another common view is that it is referring to the end of history and the final judgment, and the extremities, the toes and the horns, are actually later kings, empires that come out from the 4th beast or from the legs, but they have not yet been on the earth, or at least they weren't at the time of Jesus, and they are for the end of history when God will wrap up history, but they derive in some way from the old Roman Empire. Again, these are different ways, you see, that people have understood them, and I don't think at this point we should be too dogmatic at this stage of our trying to interpret it. My own inclination is that the way in which the vision is depicted is that it is the final judgment. It's the end of all these Gentile empires of any kind. Because the final empire seems so extreme that it triggers the little horn in particular triggers a response from God, an interventionary response. And then there's this stream of fire here in chapter 7, this big rock in chapter 2, where it's just complete annihilation or destruction of the government. So it seems to me that it is depicting sort of the end of history, although I do think that's, in some ways, that might seem a little harder as a way to understand the vision than just thinking it's at the time of Jesus and it's with Rome. But I think as we go on later in the visions, the other visions we're going to see, I think it actually will make it more natural to read the rest of the book this way. All right, so that, anyway, it seems to me, is the basic interpretation. The last thing we're going to do with this chapter is talk a little bit more about the little horn. What is it that's so much of a focus about this little horn? And what's sort of unprecedented about the little horn, such that the little horn triggers what seems to be at least an apocalyptic judgment, and what I think is the final judgment on all human governments, the one that will then precede immediately the coming of the divine figure who is like a son of man, who will then rule the world from that point on into eternity. So, best wishes with that. We'll see you next time.